Freedom does not always arrive with open arms. Sometimes it crawls through the dark, smelling of blood and fear. In the shadowed heart of Alabama, where the cotton fields stretched like endless graves under a bruised sky, the spring of 1865 whispered promises that twisted into nightmares. The wind carried echoes of distant cannons, fading now as the Civil War gasped its last breaths. But here on the plantations, time clung stubbornly to the old ways, refusing to let go. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming magnolias masking the rot beneath. The faint decay of fallen leaves mingled with the sharper tang of sweat-soaked soil, where roots delved deep into layers of unspoken suffering. Enslaved souls stirred in their quarters, their bodies aching from dawn to dusk toil, their hearts pounding with a fragile hope that tasted like ash. Word of abolition slithered through the cracks, rumors from runaway messengers, scraps of news stolen from overseers' drunken talk, passed in hurried glances during water breaks or under the cover of night. Yet for every spark of joy, suspicion coiled tighter, like vines around a throat, their thorns drawing invisible blood. The masters and their whips still ruled, their eyes sharp as knives, their fists unyielding, patrolling the edges of the fields where the sun beat down like a relentless judge. Freedom? It was a ghost, haunting the edges of their dreams, but never quite stepping into the light, its form shifting and elusive, promising release while whispering of traps yet to spring. In this world of whispers and watchful shadows, Samuel's existence unfolded like a frayed thread in a vast, blood-stained tapestry. The slave quarters were crude wooden shacks, their walls thin as paper, breathing in the night air, laced with the metallic tang of sweat and fear, planks creaking under the weight of weary bodies, collapsing onto straw pallets that scratched like accusations. Lanterns flickered low, casting long, wavering shapes that danced like restless spirits across the dirt floors, where footprints from the day's labor mingled with older marks, etched deep as scars. Here, families huddled close, sharing stories in hushed tones, tales of ancestors stolen from distant shores, of rebellions crushed under boot heels, of gods who seemed deaf to their pleas, their voices rising and falling like the tide of a height. Hidden river. Joy was a rare visitor, always weighed down by grief. A child's laugh might echo briefly, only to be silenced by the crack of a distant whip or the low moan of someone nursing fresh welts in the corner. The ground itself remembered, every furrow in the field soaked with tears, every scar on a map of endurance, the earth cool and unforgiving under bare feet that had trodden it for generations. Samuel moved through this haze like a figure from an old folktale, his frame bent but unbroken, his eyes holding secrets deeper than the nearby swamps, where gnarled cypress trees stood sentinel, their roots twisting like the fingers of buried hands. The quarters were alive with anticipation that night, as if the very soil hummed with unspoken plans. Vibrations felt through the soles of feet pressed against the ground. Mothers clutched their young ones tighter, their arms wrapping like protective vines. Fathers stared into the fire's embers, seeing futures both bright and blackened, flames crackling softly, spitting sparks that died in the heavy air. But beneath it all lurked terror, the knowledge that overseers prowled like wolves, their lanterns swinging in rhythmic arcs, casting pools of yellow light that revealed and concealed in equal measure, their voices barking orders that echoed into the void, laced with the threat of violence. What should have been liberation felt instead like the calm before a storm, where thunder rumbled low and the air grew electric with dread, static prickling skin like invisible insects. History pressed close, its fingers cold on their necks, turning hope into a double-edged blade sharp enough to cut free or to wound deeper. The scent of wood smoke from dying fires mingled with the faint, herbal bitterness of poultices applied to old injuries, a reminder that healing was slow, if it came at all. As the moon climbed higher, casting silver veins across the fields like threads of fate, a single owl's cry pierced the silence, a omen, some whispered, of changes that would demand a price. its call lingering in the branches like a question unanswered. The quarters fell quieter still, breaths held in collective suspense, the silence thick enough to touch, broken only by the occasional rustle of shifting bodies or the distant bay of a hound. Freedom was knocking, but its hand was stained, and the door it sought might lead not to light, but to a deeper darkness waiting just beyond, where shadows whispered of reckonings yet to unfold. And in that hush, Samuel's ember began to glow, unseen but unquenchable, drawing the night toward a path where liberation and vengeance intertwined like roots in fertile soil. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the faint scent of approaching rain, as if the heavens themselves prepared to weep for what was to come. The fields lay still under the star-pricked sky, but beneath the surface, tensions simmered, like water about to boil over. Whispers passed from one shack to another, fragments of plans and fears, weaving a web of quiet resistance. Samuel listened, his silence a cloak, as the night deepened, the air cooling to a chill that seeped into bones weary from the day's burdens. This was the threshold where the promise of freedom hung like a noose, tightening or loosening, no one could yet say. In the dim glow of a dying fire, Samuel sat alone, his calloused hands tracing the ridges of scars that mapped his back like twisted rivers carved by relentless storms. He was no towering legend, no voice raised in defiant song. He was a shadow, forged in the furnace of endless days under a merciless sun that baked the Alabama earth into cracked clay. The air in his shack hung stale, scented with the faint mustiness of straw and the lingering sharpness of lye soap used to scrub away the day's grime, though some stains went deeper than skin. Samuel's world was one of measured breaths and hidden glances, where silence was both shield and weapon, a flame smoldering quietly within, waiting for the breath of change to ignite it. The years had carved him deep, each one a layer of hardship pressed upon him like sediment in a riverbed. He remembered the lashes that split skin like rotten fruit, the leather cracking through the air with a whistle that still echoed in his nightmares, blood pooling in the dirt to form muddy rivulets that the sun dried into dark stains. Overseers, laughter rang out then, harsh and guttural, as men bled and women cried in the fields, their sobs muffled by the rustle of cotton bolls swaying in the breeze. Each insult was a stone added to his burden, the stolen meals that left bellies hollow, the broken promises of mercy that dissolved like mist at dawn, the children sold away under cover of night, their cries fading into the distance like ghosts. Retreating. Prayer circles formed in the quarters, voices lifting to heavens that offered no reply, harmonious, yet desperate. But Samuel turned inward, his knees unbent in supplication, his faith rooted in the earth rather than the sky. His fury grew with every dawn, a silent ember fed by the wind of whispered injustices, glowing hotter in the quiet hours when the plantation slept. By 1865, as rumors of abolition rustled like dry leaves through the quarters, carried on the lips of those brave enough to speak them, Samuel had become more than flesh and bone, a vessel, brimming with justice long denied, its surface calm, but its core molten, ready to spill over. The air in the quarters grew thicker, scented with wood smoke from communal fires and the unspoken rage that simmered like stew over low flames, bubbles rising slowly to the surface. Freedom's promise echoed hollow in his ears. What good was release without retribution, without the scales tipping back from years of imbalance? The swamps nearby murmured secrets at night, their waters black and still, reflecting stars like forgotten eyes watching his resolve harden. Memories haunted him like ghosts in the mist, drifting through his mind in the quiet moments between labor and rest. The crack of whips at first light, sharp as breaking bone, the metallic bite of chains against wrists raw from picking thorns that pricked like accusations, the suffocating heat that turned breath to fire in lungs already strained. Overseers paraded their cruelty, faces flushed with stolen power, their boots grinding hope into dust beneath heels worn smooth from endless patrols. Samuel watched, silent, as friends crumbled, One hanged for a glance too bold, rope creaking. In the wind like a morbid lullaby, another worked until his heart gave out, collapsing in the furrows with a final, ragged gasp. These wounds festered, turning pain into purpose, each scar a reminder etched in flesh, textured and raised under his fingers as he traced them in the dark. Yet in his silence, there was a poetry of endurance, a folkloric strength that whispered, of old spirits rising from the earth, ancient and unyielding. The shadows in his eyes held stories untold, of nights when the moon watched impassively and the swamps gurgled with hidden life, bubbles breaking the surface like suppressed truths. As abolition's rumors swelled, carried on winds that smelled of distant gunpowder and change, Samuel felt the shift, like the ground trembling before a quake, vibrations traveling up through his feet planted firmly on the dirt floor. But he knew, true liberation demanded more than words on paper, scrawled by hands far removed from the fields. It required the settling of scores, the quenching of that inner fire in the blood of those who had kindled it, a ritual as old as oppression itself. The night deepened, stars pricking the sky like distant eyes bearing witness, and Samuel rose, his movements deliberate as a predator's stalking through underbrush. The quarters stirred faintly around him, the soft snores and murmurs of sleepers unaware that his flame was about to illuminate horrors long buried in the collective memory. But first, the overseers would feel the heat, their grip on power slipping into the abyss they had dug for others, the air growing warmer with anticipation. Samuel stepped outside, the cool night breeze brushing his skin like a lover's touch, turned cold, carrying the scent of pine and impending rain. His plan, long nurtured in silence, began to unfold, threads pulling tight in the web of fate. The fields lay quiet, but beneath, roots intertwined, much like the bonds of those who had suffered together, ready to rise. In the distance, a dog howled, its voice lonely and piercing, as if sensing the ember's glow turning to flame. Samuel's heart beat steady, a drum in the quiet, each thump a step closer to the edge where vengeance waited, patient as the earth itself. They loomed like gnarled oaks in a storm-ravaged field, these 5 overseers, their shadows stretching long and twisted across the plantation grounds, distorting in the fading light of dusk. Even as the Confederacy crumbled like ash in the wind, scattered by the relentless advance of Union forces, they stood defiant, their whips coiled at their sides like dormant serpents, eyes gleaming with the residue of unchallenged cruelty that had defined their lives. The spring air, once sweet with the promise of renewal, now carried the sour tang of their sweat and spite, mingled with the earthy aroma of tilled soil and the faint acrid smoke from their pipes, puffed in arrogant puffs as they surveyed their domain. Names like thorns that pricked the mind. Harlan, with his scarred knuckles from countless brawls and a bellowing laugh that echoed across the fields like thunder mocking the oppressed. Elias, lean and snake-quick, his gaze piercing souls as sharply as a blade, always watching, always waiting for the slightest infraction. The brothers Thorn and Silas, broad-shouldered brutes who shared a taste for breaking spirits, their hands heavy as hammers, their voices a guttural chorus of commands. And Old Man Crow, the eldest, his voice a rasp like dry leaves scraping over gravel, commanding fear with tales of past punishments whispered to keep the quarters in line. They had grown fat on the misery of others, feasting on stolen labor, that filled their pockets, reveling in the power that let them crush lives without consequence, their bellies swelling with ill-gotten meals while those they ruled scraped by on meager rations. Rumors of emancipation. They spat them out like bitter seeds into the dirt, boasting in the dim light of their cabins that chains are stronger than laws scribbled by fools in Washington, their words laced with venom, echoing off walls adorned with trophies of their cruelty. Old whips hung like decorations, rusted shackles as mementos. Their hands, calloused from wielding pain rather than honest work, clenched tighter around rifles and reins, refusing to yield even as the world shifted beneath them, the ground seeming to soften with the weight of impending change. In the quarters, their presence was a constant chill, like fog rolling in from the swamps, thick and cloying, seeping into bones and dreams alike. They wandered at dusk, boots thudding on packed earth with deliberate heaviness, their lanterns casting erratic glows that turned familiar paths into labyrinths of dread, light flickering over faces twisted in perpetual scowls. Brutality was their creed, a lash for a slow step, the whip's crack splitting the air like lightning, a boot for a whispered word, leaving imprints in flesh and memory. Samuel watched them from the edges, hidden in shadows that clung like old friends, seeing not men but walking graves, hollow shells, cursed by the weight of sins that clung like grave dirt, their souls blackened as the smoke from their fires. Their laughter echoed hollow now, laced with desperation as they squeezed one last drop of control from those they deemed beneath them, their voices rising in false bravado during evening gatherings. Freedom's whisper grew louder, carried on breezes that rustled the cotton plants like fingers brushing secrets, but they drowned it with threats, their eyes wild with the knowledge that their empire of suffering was fraying at the seams, threads pulling loose one by one. Yet in their defiance, there was a folkloric doom, as if the land itself marked them for judgment, the vines curling subtly toward their paths with insidious intent, the wind carrying faint, mocking echoes of past cries that only the guilty could hear. They armed themselves heavier, rifles slung over shoulders heavy with paranoia, patrolled deeper into the night, their footsteps crunching leaves like bones underfoot, reminding the enslaved that dreams of liberty were illusions, fragile as spider, silk torn by the slightest gust. But arrogance blinds, and theirs was a veil thick with pride, unaware that eyes in the shadows plotted, that silence bred storms gathering force in the quiet. The air around them grew thicker, scented with the metallic edge of fear they projected onto others, masking their own growing unease. As midnight crept closer, the overseers gathered in their crude hall, a ramshackle building lit by sputtering candles, voices raised in drunken toasts to a dying era, glasses clinking like the chains they cherished. Whiskey burned their throats, loosening tongues to boast of unbroken rule, their laughter a brittle shield against the encroaching dawn, faces flushed red in the warm glow. Little did they know, their refusal to die had sealed their fate, turning them into prey for the reckoning that stirred just beyond the lantern's reach, the night air humming with unseen energy. The stars above watched impassively, pinpricks in the velvet sky, as the plantation held its breath, the ground beneath their feet already whispering of graves to come. Shadows pooled deeper, textures rough under wandering feet, and the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of damp earth ready to receive. The night of abolition settled like a shroud over the plantation, the moon veiled in thin clouds that diffused its light into a ghostly haze, casting the fields in shades of silver and black. Whispers rustled through the quarters, like unseen, footsteps padding softly on dirt paths, the air alive with a restless hum, crickets falling silent one by one, leaves stirring without wind as if brushed by spectral hands. It was as if the earth itself held its breath, anticipating the line, where hope blurred into horror, the boundary thin and trembling like a spider's web laden with dew. Samuel moved through this veil, a spectre in the gloom, his hands gathering tools that gleamed faintly in the starlight. Ropes coiled like serpents ready to strike, shovels with edges worn from tilling cursed soil, nails sharp as accusations, glinting coldly. Ordinary things these, forged for labor in the smithy's heat, now twisted into instruments of a grim ritual, their handles smooth from years of use, now gripped with new purpose. The wind carried faint scents of loamy earth and distant rain, mingling with the acrid bite of fear that seeped from every shack, where doors creaked faintly on rusted hinges. Samuel's steps were deliberate, soft as falling ash, as he slipped from shadow to shadow, his breath measured to avoid detection. The quarters transformed under his touch. What was once a place of weary rest became a stage for vengeance, walls echoing with the subtle clink of metal against metal, floors creaking, under hidden burdens like the groans of old bones. He did not act alone in spirit. Others watched from cracked doors, eyes wide in the dimness, reflecting the faint glow of embers, too afraid or too scarred to join, their faces etched with lines of hardship. Their silence was consent, a heavy blanket that muffled doubts and amplified the night's dread. Breaths held as Samuel passed, the air thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and flickering hope. Deeper into the hours, the gathering built like a slow storm brewing on the horizon, clouds gathering mass. Samuel paused in the heart of the quarters, where the ground dipped slightly, soft and yielding from years of trodden feet, textured like the palm of a hand worn by toil. Here, he arranged his harvest, a hammer's dull thud testing wood for strength, ropes tested for give against imagined struggles, pulling taut with a whispery snap. Memories fueled him, the ghosts of lashes that burned like fire, the echoes of souled kin crying out in the night, each tool an extension of his silent flame, glowing hotter in the cool air. The air grew thicker still, scented with pine resin, from nearby woods that loomed like silent guardians, and the faint metallic tang of blood long spilled but never forgotten. Whispers among the watchers grew, faint as breath fogging in the chill. The wind's changing, one murmured low, voice trembling like leaves, carrying judgment on its back. But fear coiled tight in chests. No one stepped forward, leaving Samuel to weave the trap alone, his movements a dark ballet in the flickering torchlight that he dared not light too brightly. The overseers, oblivious in their distant hall, drank deep that night, their jeers rolling out like thunder over empty fields, glasses clinking amid bursts of laughter that carried on the breeze. Whiskey burned their throats, loosening tongues to boast of unbroken rule, their voices slurred but defiant, unaware of the noose tightening. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, pooling like ink around the quarter's edges, each sound amplified in the hush. A shovel's scrape against stone sending shivers, a rope's whisper through hands like a sigh of resignation, the distant hoot of an owl like a warning unheeded, piercing the veil. The line between freedom and damnation thinned to a razor's edge, the night pulsing with anticipation, heartbeats sinking in the dark. Samuel's plan took shape, a web of earth and intent, designed not for glory, but for burial, where justice would swallow arrogance whole, the ground seeming to soften in readiness. Nails were driven into place with muffled taps, ropes knotted with precision, each action layered with the weight of years. As the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, the quarters fell into an eerie hush, broken only by the soft thud of tools being set aside, handles resting against walls. The trap was laid, invisible yet inescapable, the air electric with the promise of upheaval, static raising hairs on arms. But in that stillness, a chill seeped in, as if the ground hungered for what was to come, ready to claim its due beneath the feet of the unwary, the soil cool and inviting like an open grave. Samuel stepped back, surveying his work in the gloom, his breath visible in faint puffs, the night wrapping around him like a cloak. The wind shifted again, carrying snippets of the overseer's revelry, a reminder of the arrogance soon to be quenched. Quarters breathed as one, a collective entity waiting, the textures of wood and earth familiar yet transformed. Freedom's edge loomed, sharp and unforgiving, as the gathering concluded in silence, tools poised like actors in a tragedy about to unfold. Midnight fractured into fragments of shadow and silence as the overseers stumbled toward the quarters, their boots heavy on the path, crunching gravel like bones underfoot, voices slurred with liquor and lingering power that clung to them like a foul odor. The air clung damp and cool, scented with the earthy musk of turned soil and the faint acrid bite of their sweat mingled with whiskey fumes. Samuel waited in the gloom, his breath steady as a heartbeat in the dark, his form blending with the shack walls like a forgotten curse etched into wood. This was the climax, not of fire and fury that lit the night sky, but of suffocating quiet, the night when symbols of slavery would be consigned to the earth they had defiled, swallowed whole by the land's patient maw. It began with Harlan, the loudest of the lot, his lantern swinging erratically like a pendulum marking doom as he barked orders into the void, his voice echoing off the shacks. Samuel struck from the darkness, a rope looping swift around his neck with a whispery hiss, muffling his roar to a gurgle that bubbled wetly. The struggle was brief, brutal. Harlan's fists flailing against unyielding hands, knuckles grazing air, his eyes bulging in the dim light as veins stood out like ropes themselves, before he was dragged into the quarter's underbelly, feet scraping, furrows in the dirt. The others followed one by one, lured by the absence of their comrade's bellows. Elias, snake-like and wary, his lean frame twisting in vain as shadows enveloped him, overpowered in a whisper of movement that left him bound and gasping. The brothers Thorne and Silas came next, their broad frames no match for the surprise of ropes snapping tight, their grunts muffled by cloths pressed hard, bodies heaving as they were hauled into the dim space beneath the floors. Old Crow last, his rasp turning to desperate wheezes, like wind through cracked branches, his frail form trembling as ropes bound his limbs, eyes darting in terror. No blaze of battle, no heroic clash that rang with steel, just the efficient drag of bodies across dirt floors textured with years. Of footprints, their cries stifled by cloths soaked in the night's own chill, fabric rough against skin. The air thickened with the scent of fear sweat and exertion, heavy as a blanket. The digging commenced under the quarter's raised floors, where the soil lay soft and secret, damp with the accumulated sweat and blood of generations, yielding easily, to shovels that bit deep with rhythmic thuds. Each strike was a funeral drum beat echoing in the confined space, vibrations traveling up through the earth, the air growing thick, heavy with the scent of fresh loam turned over, rich and cloying. Shadows danced wildly from a single buried lantern, its flame flickering like a trapped soul, casting grotesque shapes on the walls of the pits. Samuel worked methodically, his muscles corded from years of forced labor, now turned to this dark purpose, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool night. The overseers, bound and gagged, writhed in the shallow pits, eyes wide with terror reflecting the lantern's glow, muffled pleas vibrating through the ground like distant thunder rolling. "Lo, this is justice," Samuel murmured once, his voice a low rumble that blended with the shovel's scrape, not for them, but for the ghosts that watched from the edges of light. Harlan went first, lowered alive into his grave, soil cascading over, him in waves like a dark tide, his body convulsing as dirt filled his mouth and nostrils. His screams swallowed by the earth's embrace, fading to gurgles, then silence. Elias clawed at the sides, nails breaking against roots that seemed to twist like accusing fingers, soil crumbling back onto him relentlessly. The brothers were buried side by side, their shared strength futile against the weight of vengeance, their final breaths ragged and shared in the dimness, mounds rising over them like barrows of old. Crow, the eldest, stared up with hollow eyes, his body trembling as layers of soil sealed him in, the ground reclaiming what it had long been. Ode, his rasps turning to whimpers buried deep. With each mound smoothed over by calloused hands, the air grew heavier, as though the land absorbed their essence, the quarter's floors creaking faintly above like a lid on a coffin closing shut. This was no mere revenge. It was a burial of chains that had rattled for decades, of whips that had sung their cruel song, of stolen lives interred in ritual. A folkloric offering to the spirits of the oppressed, where the symbols of slavery were interred alive, their arrogance entombed in silence eternal. The night stretched onward, the shovel's cadence slowing as exhaustion crept in like fog. But Samuel pressed on, his hands blistered and raw, his eyes burning with the fire he had harbored so long. Whispers from the watchers filtered down through cracks, some in awe, voices trembling, others in hushed prayer that rose like smoke. As the earth trembled subtly, accepting its grim feast with a low sigh. The scents intensified, metallic, blood from minor struggles where nails had scratched, the cloying richness of disturbed soil heavy with history, the faint rot of old grievances unearthed in the process. Freedom's dawn loomed on the horizon, but here in the depths, it was forged in damnation, each grave a testament to endurance turned lethal, the pits filling methodically. The overseer's muffled cries faded to whimpers, then to nothing but the occasional shift of earth, the ground settling over them like a final, unforgiving blanket, smooth and unyielding. As the last shovelful fell with a soft patter, Samuel straightened, the quarters now a mausoleum disguised as humble homes, the air still and pregnant. The ritual complete, the weight of what had been done hung like a pall, a offering that bound liberator and land in uneasy pact. But dawn's first light would reveal if this burial cleansed or cursed, as echoes lingered beneath the soil, faint vibrations like claws scratching, waiting to stir once more. Dawn crept over the Alabama fields like a reluctant witness, its pale light filtering through mist that clung to the ground like spectral breath, swirling in eddies around the quarter's edges. Samuel stood over the disturbed earth beneath the shacks, his chest heaving with ragged breaths, hands caked in dirt that smelled of finality and regret, grains embedding under nails like persistent memories. Freedom had arrived at last, announced by distant bells tolling across the landscape, and the rustle of papers bearing emancipation's seal carried on winds that now felt mocking. But it did not wash clean. It lingered, soaked in the venom of vengeance, leaving a stain that time could not erase, a shadow that stretched longer in the morning light. The air grew warmer as the sun climbed, but a chill remained, seeping from the ground like cold fingers grasping ankles. Samuel's eyes, hollow as the pits he had filled, scanned the horizon where fields met forest, the trees standing silent as judges. For the rest of his days, he would carry the weight. Hollow eyes reflecting muffled cries that echoed in his dreams, replaying like a cursed melody, the soil's chill seeping into his bones even on the hottest afternoons. The quarters stirred slowly, doors creaking open to reveal faces etched with a mix of awe and fear, whispers spreading like ripples in a pond. "It's done," some said, voices low, while others crossed themselves, glancing at the floors that now hid secrets. Rumors bloomed like weeds in the fertile soil of folklore, twisting and growing with each retelling around fires that crackled softly at night. Some said Samuel vanished into the whispering forests that bordered the plantation, a shadow merging with ancient oaks whose branches reached like skeletal arms, never to be seen again, his footsteps fading into the underbrush where vines concealed paths. Others whispered of Union soldiers marching in with bayonets glinting, uncovering the graves with shovels that mirrored Samuel's own, their faces grim as they dragged him to a hasty tree, a noose claiming him swiftly under an indifferent sky painted with dawn's hues. But among the freed, his name twisted into legend, a story told in firelight that danced on walls, a warning etched in folklore passed from elder to child, a ghost haunting the edges of memory like mist in the mornings. The land itself seemed changed, the earth beneath the quarters settling with subtle shifts, as if digesting its meal. Grasses growing thicker over the spots, unnaturally green. Nights brought unease, the wind sighing through cracks like breaths from below, carrying faint scents of damp soil and something metallic like old blood. Folks avoided walking too heavily, lest the floors creak in protest, revealing the hidden. Samuel's act became a tale of caution, how freedom's price could bind the soul, how vengeance, once unleashed, clung like burrs to clothing. In gatherings, voices would drop low, recounting the details, the muffled thuds, the ritualistic burial, as if speaking louder might summon the past. And on nights when the earth trembles in Alabama, some swear it is not the wind rustling leaves or distant thunder, but the buried overseers clawing at the soil, their fingers scraping against roots, still trying to rise from their shallow tombs. The vibrations felt through feet, a rhythmic scratching that sets dogs to howling and children to whimpering in sleep. Their arrogance eternal, their graves restless, forever bound to the land they once ruled with iron fists, now prisoners of the dirt they trod upon. The moon watches these nights, casting light that turns the fields silver, highlighting mounds that no one dares disturb. Stories evolved, adding layers like sediment. Some claim to see shadows moving under the quarters at midnight, elongated, forms twisting in agony. Others heard whispers in the wind, pleas for mercy that echoed the overseer's final moments. Samuel's ghost, they said, wandered the swamps, his form translucent, eyes burning with that silent flame, guarding against any who might dig up the past. The freed built new lives atop the old, but the foundation remained tainted, a reminder that liberation carried ghosts. As years passed, the tale spread beyond the plantation, carried by travelers on dusty roads, becoming part of the region's dark lore, whispered in taverns and around hearths far away. Yet in the quiet dawns, when fog blanketed the ground, one could almost feel the unresolved dread, the air heavy with unspoken curses. Freedom's dawn had come, but its light revealed scars that ran deep, etched into earth and soul alike. The overseer's refusal to die truly manifested in memory, their legacy, a tremor that never fully stilled, a folkloric echo binding the living to the buried. And so the story endures, a haunting refrain in Alabama's winds, where the past claws eternally at the present.